We are really looking forward to we have a panel discussion that's being teed up. This is all part of what we call our integrated grid planning process, otherwise known as IGP. Okay, so tonight we'll really be focusing on having a good discussion about various topics such as technical energy system issues, uses of land, for example, other uses of land for agriculture. We have community engagement, community impacts, financial issues, resilience. So we have a variety of topics that our panel will tee up for discussion among themselves. But then also as part of that process, those of you here in the audience will be able to provide questions that our moderator, Linda, and I'll introduce Linda later on, that she'll be able to then, actually she'll explain the process. I don't want to mess up her process, okay? But nonetheless, that's sort of what we will be teeing up now after I finish here. IGP is a very important process for us. It's really intended to help us set a long-range path forward for the energy system for the islands that Hawaiian Electric and that we serve, which is basically all the islands of the state with the exception of the island of Kauai. So 95% of the state's population, as we look to what the needs of the energy system are, we know that we have to have energy for customers and communities that is reliable, that is affordable, and even more so, that is clean. Right? We see all of the pressures upon us, our customers, our communities, that they need to have energy that they can rely on. We have so many different hazards, I say, that man-made as well as natural, that all of us are actually dealing with, even as we sit here, that we know as we look to the future, whatever we design in this energy system of ours, it has to be able to provide that power. The climate change issues are very real, and especially all of us here in Hawaii, we see the impacts of whether it's sea level rise, more unpredictable storm activity and such. So again, that also sets the context for why it's so important for us to have this broader discussion. You will hear from our panel about issues that our communities are facing, right? So the challenges of siting of infrastructure, of siting renewable energy projects. Those are very real. Those are very real on the part of many of our communities. And somehow we have to bring people together to understand what the trade-offs are as we make different choices for the future. Okay, so that is a very, very critical part of this process. I'm just gonna thank all of you again for being here, because ultimately, we are not here, I am not here to try and sell you on a particular energy plan for the future. I am not here to say, hey, I've got a wonderful set of ideas for specific projects and this is what we really should do. Okay, as part of our long-range process, it has been a very complicated process. It has involved many of you as council stakeholders or technical resources. And the job that we have is to try and take as much of this input and provide options and alternatives for consideration. And at the end of the day, this is a long-range plan. It provides the guidance and the direction for all of us as we move forward. So again, thank you for being here. This is going to be truly a collective effort. So with that, I'm going to introduce the facilitator for the panel discussion. So Linda Colburn. Linda has helped us moderate and facilitate a variety of good discussions on different topics in the past, and she is, her firm is called Where Talk Works. So, Linda.
Aloha and welcome, everyone. We realize you have other things you could be doing this evening and are very pleased that you chose to be here to hear from the panel that has been assembled for your benefit. My name is Linda Colburn, and I'm joined this evening by Nicole Brody, who is going to help us capture questions and comments you might have through the use of your smart devices or moderately intelligent devices, depending on who you subscribe to. But how many of you have smartphones or tablets this evening? Okay. We regret that there's not likely to be time to hear from every single person that has a comment. So if you have a smart device and you're open to putting the address sift.ly into your browser, that will take you to a site, and then you'll be asked for a code. Now, if you don't have a smartphone or do not wish to use your smartphone, we have question cards that can be passed to you so that you can write your questions down, and we'll collect those throughout the discussion so that we can use the remaining time to sift through those and get some of the additional benefits of the group we have gathered here. So how many of you are on the site? Okay, and it asks for a code. I think the code tonight is for this particular event is L as in Louisiana, A as in Aardvark, 5, and D as in Demented. So that should get you into the site. You may see a question there as we are beginning the discussions. And the question has to do with, of the energy-related priorities listed, which one is most important to you? And so if you would like to cast your response to that by choosing the one that you favor currently and hitting submit, you'll see in real time as the answers are coming in, they're being calibrated on this exhibit on the screen. This is looking a lot like some primary results. Okay. So you can continue to do that for a while, but to best use our time this evening, would like to go directly into the panel discussion. And the first panelist we have prepared to speak this evening is Cynthia Rezantes. And Cynthia, you have been doing community work for as long as I can remember, which is longer than I care to admit. Cynthia has chaired the neighborhood board for Nanakuli for a while and has been in the neighborhood board system since 1994. So she knows how things work in her community and understands the issues. When I tried to do some background look up, there's 62,200 results in 0.41 seconds on Cynthia. Noteworthy among the things mentioned, membership in the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, president of Kealaho West Oahu, which is a nonprofit that runs outreach services and emergency shelter for the homeless on the Leeward Coast. This Y&I high school graduate got her BS degree in electrical and electronics engineering, and then an MS degree in electrical and electronics engineering from from University of Mexico. She could speak on any number of topics, but this evening I'd like to start us out, if we could, with kind of an open-ended question. You've long been an advocate for communities who have concerns about proposed projects that have been suggested for their communities. And I'm wondering if you could kind of share your best advice about how communities can successfully engage proponents of projects in their community. What's the sort of 101 for successful community engagement?
Thanks, Linda. I guess my message to everybody is get involved early. None of these projects are easy to follow. They're also extremely time-consuming, so when you commit to something, you're going to have to commit to the long haul. I will let you know that we have so many different processes that all of these projects go through. Whether you're going through the Planning Commission on island through the City Council, the Land Use Commission from a state perspective, or if you even are going to the PUC. Each have different guidelines on how to approach their piece of the puzzle. And trying to work your way through those pieces of the puzzle are not easy. So the earlier you can educate yourself, at least from an overall viewpoint of what each has, that you need to at least be aware of, the better you are. Because once the process starts moving, it's very difficult to learn as you go. Because if it moves, sometimes it can move very quickly, at which point, if you're not on top of deadlines for how long in which you have to respond to certain aspects, you can be left in the dust. So the best thing I can say is if you're interested, especially in, as we're progressing to 2045 for 100% renewables, start getting to know right now what all those processes are and how you can get involved, and know yourself what you're willing to accept and or concede to be able to get the best benefit for your community. Whether it's going to be a complete killing of the project, or can you accept this versus that happening? Unless you can put your story together and work with others in your community for what you're willing to accept, not accept, and how you're willing to proceed, it's going to be very difficult. As we've seen recently, sometimes if you get in too far at the end, you're relegated to protesting, which may or may not work at all. So the idea is to get involved early, to be able to help guide the process so that you can be a part of that guidance, not just have it dumped on your community.
When you use the term dumped, clearly some communities feel more impositions than others. Could you say a little bit about that concentration and density of projects?
I think what every community believes that they're getting dumped on, but I think, and again, I'll give my perspective from the west side of Oahu. You know, I can literally count off the various heavy industrial projects that we have there, the 2 refineries in the state, probably about 5 different generating facilities in the state, the only 2 landfills on the island, and we can just go on and on about that. The question is, at what point does one community become the recipient of the core structure for the rest of the island, or should that be distributed? Should everybody have a piece of that rather than everything be, and I know I'm using the word everything and it's not everything, but the majority of these large projects that are not necessarily wanted elsewhere to be placed in one select community area.
Okay. Is there anything you'd like to add to that about project density? You mentioned situating things in other locations is an option. Are there any other thoughts you have on that that you would like people to hear about tonight?
Well, the question becomes one, given where we're headed, is there a possibility of renewable projects being put in downtown Honolulu rather than in an area that either is virgin farmland or conservation land? Can we do more in the built-up areas of Honolulu, like putting all hotels have to have rooftop solar? Who has proposed that? Rather than let's put it out in the middle of Kunia and let's take up the farmland in Kunia. And yet we're charged with doubling our food input at the same time. So I think those are some of the things that I think we all need to look at from a total community standpoint.
Okay. You'll have a chance to hear more from Cynthia in a moment, but I'd like to move on, if we could, to Murray, who's next. Murray Clay is the president of Ulupono Initiatives, and there he guides the investment team on its overall strategy and processes in furtherance of Ulupono's mission. If you've not heard of Ulupono before, its mission is to improve the quality of life for island residents in 4 key areas. Those areas include locally produced food, clean and renewable energy, better management of water and waste. Murray brings about 15 plus years of experience in managing hedge funds. and in managing private equity portfolios. He has also, prior to his finance career, served as an intelligence officer for the U.S. Air Force Special Operations Forces for 5 years, and is a graduate of the Air Force Academy with a BS in International Affairs and a minor in Japanese. He serves on a couple of local boards, but in his spare time has pondered the matters associated with renewable energy. And this evening, I'd like to, since you're an early adapter of the idea of 100% renewable energy and that the state has formally embraced that as a goal, comment, if you would, about how Hawaii fares with respect to other jurisdictions looking at renewable energy.
Sure, and I'm not from Hawaii originally, I hope it's okay to say that I'm just very proud of this state, because if you think about it, I know probably almost everyone in this room knows this, but 1.4 million people, give or take, first state in the nation to adopt 100% renewable energy, and all these big states with much more resources took time and years after that to follow on, and now there's 11 or 12, I think if you include District of Columbia, states or districts that have adopted either 100% clean or renewable energy. They kind of differ between what is clean or renewable, but we've had like a half dozen or a dozen or so follow us as one of the smallest states to follow our example. And now, even though I understand that this is about integrated grid planning and not performance-based regulation, since I'm so passionate about performance-based regulation, I can't constrain myself from saying that we are also maybe not the first, but we are, I think, the most aggressive in the nation of all the states' jurisdictions that are looking at performance-based regulation to completely reimagine the way the utility is incentivized to get basically paid for doing what customers most want them to do. And I think we're going way farther out on that. Other folks are making more incremental changes. Those two things combined, 100% renewable energy goal and getting the incentives right, are just something I'm hugely proud of. And my only concern related to that is we not just get comfortable with the success, kind of blink or relax or not keep pushing forward and kind of be like your favorite sports team when they're ahead by 50 points, and they still somehow manage to fall behind, later on because they took it easy. So I want to be charging out in front as a state continuously and not, taking the foot off the accelerator. Notice I said accelerator, not gas pedal. That's important.
Relevant, highly relevant. What unique challenges do you think the state faces compared to maybe other jurisdictions that are also seeking to increase their commitment to renewable energy?
So one of the first ones, when I started comparing Hawaii's RPS to where we are with renewables, not just the goal, to other states, is one of the biggest things you have to look at is most of the states that have really high renewable numbers have very large-scale hydro. And we just don't have that. We've got some run-of-the-river stuff here, some small-scale hydro, but if you're Washington or someplace like that, you got massive dams. Yeah, you can jump up the renewables pretty high pretty quickly. But in addition to that, or despite that challenge, I guess maybe tweaking the question a little bit, I think overall, I just feel very strongly that renewables are the answer, not just from an environmental point of view, but from a customer point of view. And I think folks in Hawaii generally tend to understand that better, maybe than the average, American, I guess. I think that the combination of aggressive competitive procurements, which we have going on, two very large, one that just finished, one that's still ongoing, to get the lowest price possible through competition is the answer for utility scale. Getting customers to contribute their rooftop solar. We saw on one of those charts over there, 900 megawatts so far of customer-sided solar. So you have the customers donating, if you will, their solar. Then you've got PBR to get the incentives right for the utility. And then finally, to the topic that we're here today, integrated grid planning, to have the right plan with the incentives, with the lowest cost possible through those competitive procurements and through the customers sort of donating, if you will, their solar. That package, I think, will take us to 100%, and that's what I'm somewhere between cautiously optimistic and excited about.
Is there a recipe for success as it relates to how we approach things in this market?
I think just that maximizing competitive procurement. I mean, whenever you have a monopoly, what you lack is competition, so you bring in as much competition as you possibly can. Like I said, on the customer-sided side, you've got people that anxiously want to add solar to their houses. That's with their money, not with ratepayers' money, so let on as much of that as you can. and get the incentives right. And the nice thing about getting the incentives right, we spent a lot of time as Ulupono doing policy work and regulatory work. But if you get the incentives right, and I hope Colton won't mind me saying this, if you get the incentives right on an investor-owned utility, the shareholders will make them do the right thing. You don't have to push. You don't have to get new legislation, new regulation. If the incentives are right, the right things will happen because that's how they get paid. So that's what I'm sort of looking forward to as the recipe, is getting all those pieces together.
Okay, thank you. Some of you may know Pono Shem, seated next, and he's here tonight as president and CEO of the Oahu Economic Development Board, which is becoming an increasingly regarded hub for leadership in the state. And a web search for Pono comes up with Pono Shem and Oahu Economic Development Council, and then there's also an entry for Pono Shem Kidney, but you'll need to talk to him after the meeting to learn more about that. Not only is he gifted with respect to kidneys, but also a gifted storyteller and has a real knack for taking issues, translating them into a story, and helping essentially reframe and reposition issues so we can think about them in new ways. He has a couple of things that he wanted to kind of lead off with tonight, but one involved a Tesla and another one involved a rising tide, not necessarily sea level related. Pono, take it away.
Aloha. So we're an economic development organization, and I clearly have no background in economics. And Linda was just asking Murray, who's on my board of directors, about the recipe for success. And I think I was hired because the board of directors at the time, we were in an extremely broken organization, not just financially, but spiritually and public trust. And I think they figured out the recipe for disaster, not the recipe for success. And I think a lot of people are looking for a recipe for success, but not considering that they may have a recipe for disaster. And so they chose to hire a healer rather than an economist, because I think they recognize that pure economics is just a recipe for disaster. And really, people might be one of the most significant nuts to crack. And so Linda was asking about that theory of the rising tide lifts all boats, because I've heard that for 11 years since I've been the CEO. And at my December board meeting with our directors, I usually begin with a thought, and I said, you know, I've heard this theme for 11 years now, and it's bullshit. Because the rising tide doesn't lift all boats, it'll only lift the boats that can float. The boats that are sunk are still gonna stay sunk. And the boats that are leaking, if we don't help plug their leaks, they're gonna end up sunk. And then we wonder why there's this disparity between affluence and poverty today. And it's because we keep lifting the tide, pardon the pun, and affluence because you have the boats that can float. But are we really taking care of the boats that are sunk? And that's our perspective. I'm so blessed to have the kinds of folks like Tyler out in the audience and Murray to be on my board to support, you know, this weird guy who approaches it this way. And then I've been on the IGP Stakeholder Council meeting, and I was just sharing this a couple of weeks ago. I said, you know, so much of our conversations are driven to transportation and the electrification of transportation. And it's very significant. But one of the things I notice is Tesla drivers are some of the biggest jerk drivers I've ever seen. Now, if you're a Tesla owner, you know, and you're not it, but this is what I observed. You know, and it's almost like when you buy the car, you buy Elon Musk aura, like he's driving your car for you. My point is this, yeah, we can drive. We can get there. We could get there and be the biggest jerk community when we get there. And is that what I want for my children or grandchildren? That no longer is what I led with Aloha the foundation of us? How do we get there? So those are Linda pitched me.
Can you say a little bit more about when you reflect on how Hawaiian values and historical knowledge of culture, those things have influenced your way of doing business in the community? What connections do you see between those and ways to think constructively about renewable energy?
So I'm going to just make it very succinct. Our political, education, and economic systems have taught us to exercise the muscles that we use today. And those muscles are exercising in correction. We spend so much time arming ourselves to correct other people. But what I was gifted with as a child and given the opportunities to observe is not how to correct, but how to connect. And to me, that when I talked about the recipe for disaster, we're seeing it. Everybody's out correcting everybody else, but we don't know how to connect. How do we do that? That's not an argument to win. It's about how we silence the noise, not how do we conquer it. So it's purely based on the values that I was raised with, which are not unique to anybody in this room. But for my observation, values are not something to solve problems, they're a lifestyle. I don't go around telling people what to do or even how to do it. I share with them how I live and what I see. And they correct themselves. It's connection for me. And it's all founded in those values. Yeah.
We have an opportunity to next hear from Josh Stanbro. And Josh has been working his way through a variety of disciplines in order to reside where he is now as the Chief Resilience Officer and Executive Director for the Office of Climate Change, Sustainability, and Resilience, which if it were a Hawaiian bracelet would be enormously large and costly. He has a deep background in sustainability and has done a lot of cross-sector work, bringing people together from different sectors. He, at one time, did work and led the work at the Trust for Public Lands, the Hawaii office, where he helped local communities to permanently protect over 25,000 acres of land and dedicate a couple $100 million in land conservation funds. Though he's a graduate from Claremont McKenna College, he went on to earn a law degree at Berkeley Law, and most recently was honored with the Cali Award in Native Hawaiian Rights at the Richardson School of Law at the University of Hawaii, Manoa. So, Josh, not that you have a lot of spare time at your disposal, but I'm wondering if you could use some of that to share with us today in light of your efforts. Talk about balance as you're encountering that concept in the work that you do, balancing the exigencies of moving toward renewable energy, more renewable energy, and how one gets to that, and how that has affected your work and your current responsibilities.
Oh, thanks, Linda. I can try. First, I want to know who put me after Pono.
Are you a Tesla driver?
No. Tough act to follow. But I had this image when Pono was talking about how, a rising tide lifts all boats. And if you think about, boats don't just float on the water. They're usually tied to the dock. Some have longer ropes, some have shorter ropes. And the tide is lifting, and the boat can't necessarily rise with it, right? At some point, it's going to get pulled under. And I think that is exactly what we're seeing. We're seeing some people with longer ropes being able to make it. And I think, we're living through this amazing time right now. To talk about balance, oftentimes people talk about compromise. And I think what we're up against is some limits in the natural world where we actually, we can have political compromise, we can have, compromise between positions, but nature sort of doesn't allow for compromise. There are natural laws that, having spent many months following Te Aurere, one of the voyaging canoes around the Pacific and going through storms and squalls and everything, nature doesn't really care if you're there or not. It just does what it's going to do, and it's fueled by what it's fueled by. So I think, we're starting to enter this point where, okay, well, what is practical, or what is, what's the compromise position? And instead of thinking about it between compromises between humans or political systems, I think we need to start thinking about what's the need of nature, you take care of the Aina, it takes care of you, is a very familiar saying here. And if you don't take care of that, you keep moving further and further away from where you can actually get back into square. And I think that's what we're wrestling with now is, yes, we want balance, and I think the key point of this balance is, what Cynthia talked about too, is what's the wisdom of the community? There is wisdom in community. People are not unsophisticated. I think oftentimes folks go into communities thinking, well, they may not accept this or not that. Let's take this off the table. Let's package it the way that works for us and we think will work for them, without actually putting the different options on the table and having a balanced conversation, not about the narrowed options, but rather, here's the trade-offs, here are the possibilities. Now, can we have a real conversation with you about which ones do you want? Because I think people in our work, going out, talking about climate change, talking about resilience, especially in Hawaii. Hawaii has the highest sort of knowledge that climate change is happening. It is going to hurt me personally. They've done polling. Nowhere else across the United States has the same level of awareness. We talk about it a whole lot less than everybody else. So I think it's an interesting conundrum that people are acutely aware of the trade-offs, but I think they have a sense that people are making the trade-offs before they even get to the community, and they're making decisions for them before it gets there. I think there's a lot of room for really creative dialogue if there's an empowered long-term discussion to help actually strike a balance between all of the considerations as opposed to the ones that sort of get pre-selected sometimes.
I'm wondering if you could comment a little bit about the expectations of government's role as the state grapples with the implications of sea level change, and how are you looking at that, and what are the hot issues at the moment, and how do those maybe juxtapose with the renewable energy discussion, if at all?
Well, you may have heard yesterday, we sued all the big oil companies. I think in order to grapple with sea level rise, I think actually sea level rise is a lot further off than a lot of the more acute climate change impacts that we're going to face. Hurricanes, obviously, storm, flooding, those are going to come in bursts. They're going to come sooner in terms of time. Sea level rise is very significant. It's going to tax us immensely, and Ed is sitting here in the front. He knows exactly, what the scale and the costs are. But I think, and heat is another one. And I think, when we have to give notices that please turn your power down because it's so hot, we're stressing the grid, that's like a next year thing. It's not like a 2040 thing. And so those are the kind of things that we need to address. We need funds to address those. We need connected communities and social cohesion to address them together as a group. And if we're not talking about them, it makes it difficult. I will just end on the note around the litigation that happened yesterday. I think that one of the big issues that we are sort of holding the coattails on is that when the fossil fuel companies decided that they were going to deny and subvert the science and basically cause confusion and ambiguity for the better part of 40 years, it undermined a huge part of how we do decision making, because people rely on science, they rely on data, they rely to be able to sort of trust and make good policy, you need good science. And I think the legacy of that is that a lot of the time, no matter who you are, even if you're a renewable energy company or a utility coming into the space, people have a lack of trust in institutions. They have a lack of trust in what you're saying is the science. They don't believe the kilowatt hours or whatever else. And I think that actually can be tied back to these larger institutional acts of deceit that have undermined people's confidence in institutions.
Oh, thank you. Next, we have an opportunity to hear from Brian Miyamoto, who is the Executive Director of the Hawaii Farm Bureau. It was established in 1948. He has not been the director of it since 1948, but he has been at the helm long enough to help coordinate and understand the perspectives of over 1,900 different family members statewide who are farmers or ranchers or involved in the ag sector in some meaningful way. The Farm Bureau's purpose is to protect, advocate, and advance the social, economic, and educational interests of our diverse agricultural community. And it also coordinates across the state with the different farm bureaus to more strategically analyze and resolve agricultural challenges. Tonight, I'm thinking it might be helpful to get some insight from you about the competing interests when you look at ag, which is more often than not land-based kind of endeavor, and yet renewable energy also has land-based or land-intensive mechanisms that are part of the formula under consideration. Could you comment a little bit about the perspective from the Farm Bureau?
Is it on?
It should be.
Can you guys hear me?
No? Okay.
Not working. You know, I don't know how I got picked to follow Josh, Pono, Murray, and Cynthia. Honestly, I'm looking at this room and I'm thinking I'm in the wrong place. Not sure why we're here. I know why we're here. You know, Farm Bureau farmers, they support renewable energy. But I heard a lot talk about compromise and what did you say, Cynthia? What do you want to accept for the benefit of the community? Farmers are always compromising, but I think we're about done compromising. How do we balance two goals, two lofty, worthwhile goals, 100% renewable energy and very minimally doubling our food production? That's not increasing it 50% of local food consumed grown here in Hawaii. That's just doubling from where we are, and I can't even tell you from where we are. We don't even have those baseline numbers. Let me give you some numbers. Over the past 11 years, okay, changes to the state law, to the land use policy, Chapter 205, have dramatically increased the amount of solar facilities and their footprint on Hawaii agricultural land. 2008, our marginal lands, our lowest lands, rated D and E. Law was passed to allow solar on D and E. Despite their low productivity potential, these lands still have corn coffee on it, livestock grazing, plant nurseries. Okay, 2008, not that long ago. 2011, Act 2017, now allowed it on B and C, but there are limitations, right? 10% or 20 acres, so these are really good lands, okay? We've got A, B, C, D, and E, okay? So, okay, the line is being drawn closer and closer, okay? 2014, what did they do? Increase the amount that you can put on B and C now, okay? But what is the catch? Oh, you gotta have agriculture as a component. You gotta offer low rates for compatible agriculture. The only thing that we've seen is sheep, okay? And it works well, but that's pretty much all that we've seen since 2014. We don't really have a sheep market yet. We have a lot of sheep here in Hawaii, but we have a lot of other industries and commodities that we can grow. 2014, not a lot of people are aware of this. A lands, our best lands, were allowed. There's a timeline on that. Okay, it was specifically for a research center out in Kunia, and it was to be on roads. It couldn't take away any productive lands. 2019, there was a bill that now would open it up to our most productive A lands. And we fought that because we were tired. We support renewable energy, but at what cost? We want to double our food production, okay? I wasn't paying attention to these guys because I'm about food, and I was looking at that food, and I forgot to eat before we started, right? When we talk about sustainability, I heard somebody talk about resiliency, okay? Food, we need to balance renewable energy with food. I heard Murray talking about, or somebody talk about hydro. All of this is allowed, and we're okay with most of these things because the footprint isn't as bad as solar, even wind. Cynthia and I were talking about, does wind have an impact on agriculture? Absolutely. So does hydro, so does geothermal, all of these that are allowed in 205. But wind has a smaller footprint, and if a farmer owns their land, which a lot of farmers here in Hawaii don't, they can get some lease rent, which can allow them, because farming, their margins are razor thin. They're tough. Okay, two of the big proponents of farming and renewable energy, Dino Kimoto, Richard Ha, neither one of them are farming. Farming is a tough business. So, you know, I went around and looked at the posters, and that was great. I was looking at that grid utility poster, and all I saw was all of these solar facilities. Have you guys seen what that looks like? A solar farm. Not much farming can happen when we have solar. We're looking at other alternatives. Can we do pollinators underneath? Can we have other uses? 100% is a lofty goal. We don't want it at the expense of producing food, feed, fiber, and fuel for the state of Hawaii, but that's what we see. So land use, that's just the tip of it with renewable energy. So that's why we're here. We're here to tell you what the farmers are struggling with because they don't own the land. Okay? Ag land, and prime ag land especially, are great for development. Housing was something that we continue to fight. Now we've got to fight solar development because it's flat, it's cleared, it's got some water, it's got minimal infrastructure. It is perfect. And a landowner gets a lot more money off of a solar developer than they will lease rent off of a farmer.
Okay. Thanks very much. There's good news and bad news. The good news is that Colton Ching, who's the Senior Vice President of Planning and Technology for Hawaiian Electric, has an eclectic experience background. Sadly, the bad news is that he inherits the task of trying to sort of sum a few things up in response to what he's heard, which covers quite a wide spectrum of issues. Just FYI, Colton grew up on the island of Maui and got his bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering, and he is a licensed professional engineer. So if you get TV issues, you can call him. He is in charge of overseeing the areas of advanced planning, systems planning, T&D planning, grid technology, forecasting, and asset management, I think if I got that right. And he has responsibility for planning Hawaiian Electric's 100% renewable energy grid. So no pressure. But comment, if you would, about pieces that have moved you or things that you think it's important for the community to hear from you at this point.
So can I start off by saying go Bears?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. And if you don't know what I'm saying, then I guess you didn't grow up on Maui. And listen, there you go. It was by design that I'm the last of the panelists to speak. And it's really because, over the course of these 5 that preceded me, you're hearing both very different perspectives and points of views that has one common sort of harmony to it, right? There's one common element. And that's this issue that although no one in this room does not believe 100% renewable energy is the goal that we all need to achieve, everyone's has a perspective that and the viewpoint that there are going to be some challenges and some really big decisions that need to be made in order for us to get beyond 100% being a goal, right? To actually make it a reality and make real significant progress towards getting there. And in the course of marching towards that endpoint, there's going to be a series of very, very tough but very important discussions and, to Pono's point, connections to be made along the way. Brian spoke about the challenge of answering the question of how do you take a parcel of land who's able to do many great things, and how do you decide which one of them, or how do you break it up to do a series of things that ultimately supports a range of very, very important, equally important goals that we have in the state of Hawaii. All right, it's tough. And that's why we really teed this discussion up this evening, because integrated grid planning, this process that we're beginning, is really about taking input and viewpoints from a diverse set of customers that we have the privilege of serving every day, and communities that we serve every day, to understand their own individual and different perspectives in order to make the decisions that ultimately we need to figure out how does the grid need to transform And how do our sources of energy need to change over time in order for us to meet our state's policy, but at the same time do it in a way in delivering an electric system that has the qualities and the features that our customers want. And if anything that you get from the 5 speakers ahead of me is that answer is going to be really, really tough. And it's going to be tough to do it in a plan, but it's going to be 100 times tougher and more difficult to do it and put it into action. And so again, I think you've hopefully gotten this through the interactions that you had with my coworkers and fellow employees in the open house section, that the real value of tonight is, gosh, not to listen to me speak, but it's really for us to hear from you, right, through the discussions you've had on the panels there, but also now the 36 questions that we have waiting for us. So with that, I'll end short and turn it back to you, Linda.
Thank you. My guess was correct. Not likely that we'll be able to get to 37 questions, but let's take a look at the first one that has chosen, in part because it may be emblematic of many questions that you've submitted on your devices. So the question is to any of the panelists, or all of you: how do you feel about social justice for the impacted communities on Oahu? In particular, the projects are sent to the poorer and rural areas. I have a feeling that Cynthia might have some thoughts on that.
And I do. Actually, that's part of the reason why I was on the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council for the EPA. I come from a community that is impacted. We have been known to have very high health problems. We have a high number of people that are in the poor poverty category, and yet one of the things that our community feels like is whenever there's a project that nobody else wants, it's going to end up in our area. And whether it's us or the North Shore, some of the North Shore pockets, some of the windward side pockets, you're going to see a lot of that, because there does tend to be a little bit more impact on those communities when we're faced with these types of projects. Unfortunately, I think, and I have to remind myself of this all the time, many of us, our families move to these areas for specific reasons. In the case of both sides of my family, both sets of grandparents moved out to the area, one because we could get fee simple land rather than leasehold land in Honolulu at the time. They were interested in that rural type of a lifestyle, more agricultural type of a lifestyle versus being in Honolulu proper. So the family itself over the years made certain of those decisions. In the meantime, we get told as we're growing up, oh, you guys from the country, you guys from the sticks, you guys from this, you guys from that. Now all of a sudden, we're in the perfect place to be able to accept all of these types of projects. And so, of course, they're getting pushed out in that direction. So what happens is the social justice, the social injustice continues, maybe not said in the same way it was said when I was growing up out there, but being implied that, oh, you guys are the poor ones, you guys need all of this to be able to get the jobs or what have you, and you can just handle all of it. So I think that that plays a big role in some of the mental gyrations that people go through from these types of communities and how they respond. And I think that's why, from my standpoint, earlier involvement, talking honestly about your projects, not saying you're going to do something and then later on, all of a sudden you find it all in the newspaper. those types of things make it an even more difficult challenge for the communities that are facing some of these challenges.
I know that you wanted this question to go to all the panelists, but in the interest of time, I think Cynthia's comments were pretty comprehensive. I'm wondering if we could turn our attention to the next one. What role does transportation play in achieving our energy goals? And I suspect that one might go to Josh or Murray. Have you thoughts that you'd like to share?
Sure. So I liked, even though I was joking with Jimmy that we ought to just talk about electrification of transportation this whole time, in addition to PBR. But one of the charts over that shows the energy shows that, what was it, 61% of our energy use is transportation. So electricity is a big deal, but ground transportation is even bigger by a big, big margin. So we care very much about electrifying transportation. It is something that, despite the Tesla drivers and the perceptions that they might give you, there are EVs that are available that are kind of mid-priced EVs. It's not just for the rich anymore, and the prices are coming down. The forecasts show that it'll be price parity with gas cars in the mid-2020s, so next couple of years. On the energy front, they're 3 times more efficient than gas cars, even if you consider total life cycle emissions. So building the car, driving the car until you throw it away someday, the whole life cycle emissions are about half of a gas car. You sometimes hear this misinformation that, oh, if you consider the battery, an EV is actually worse than a gas car. Completely and utterly false. I've even heard that in energy conferences here in Hawaii. EVs are better energy-wise, they're better emission-wise. Total life cycle, it doesn't matter, they're better. And the nice thing about it, from the utilities point of view, since we are, kind of a utility topic here, is because of decoupling, all else equal, an increase of electrical load from EVs actually tends to put downward pressure on electricity prices for everybody, whether they own an EV or not. And just so you know, I'm not a hypocrite. I've been driving an EV for 5.5 years now, so I'm a believer.
I think we'll move on to the next one, just in the interest of hearing more voices and more topics. The next one is, it seems that we can strike a good balance for land use by having solar farms with vertical farming. What's your position on vertical farming?
First of all, what's a Tesla? You guys keep bringing that up.
Tractor, it's a new kind of tractor.
Yeah, EV tractors, that's Ulupono's next project, Murray. Hey, what's that question? Can we strike a good balance? That was one of the proposals. Vertical farming, indoor farming, they're the future. Greenhouse farming, which we have, but we still have to overcome what we're talking about here, the energy cost. We looked at different models. And again, if you look at a solar farm, you look at the needs of the farmer, it's tough. They propose putting it in between the panels. Talk to a farmer. It's going to be very difficult to farm. So are there opportunities? Absolutely. We're not here saying that we don't want renewable energy on ag land. Put it on our marginal land. Work with the farmers, talk to the farmers, and again, we appreciate HECO inviting us here so that we can voice the challenge of the farmers, because we're not really good telling people what's going on. And you hear about the big folks that shut down as far as farmers, but you never hear about the small ones. We've got just small farms just shutting down, and because it's just too difficult to farm. So vertical farming, to answer the question, yeah, other opportunities. Again, I've saw models where the solar panels are high enough where tractors can go under. But again, you still have limited sunlight. You still have the limited needs of what you need for farming. But if there's a solution, the ag community here in Hawaii is willing to work and try to find a solution so we can have this dual use. Again, we support renewable energy. We support clean energy to 100% goal by 2045. But we also have our goal of doubling, and we don't want to stop at doubling food production. Right? We want to increase all ag production more than double, because again, that the carbon footprint of bringing everything in, the invasive species that come in because we're importing. You guys hear the numbers, 90%. That's a lot of food that we're importing. That's very little that we're growing. So the quick answer is yes. And Rob here, who I knew from Oregon, from college, he said he was always going to start me off with 2 minutes because he says I talk too much. So thanks for starting off at 5. You give me my fair shake, Rob.
Okay, this next question, one of 45 submitted thus far, is for anyone on the panel who wishes to respond. What does 100% RPS look like to you, and what types of renewable resources and energy efficiency programs are part of your vision. I'm not sure, that's a kind of narrow set of respondents.
Maybe I can take a quick stab. I bet somebody else up here has got more technical information. But I think it's really important to remember the energy efficiency part, because if we can get more energy efficiency, we have to build less stuff that's going to take up ag land or, have to be sited in different communities. So that's really the first step, and I think that gets lost a lot of the time. We think about, okay, how are we going to build our way out of this problem rather than save our way out of the problem? The rubber meets the road. We're trying to upgrade our energy code right now, and there are certain elements of the energy code that disrupt the status quo. In order to achieve energy efficiency gains, and the status quo right now is deadly for us, just to be frank, around climate. And so it's not a question of, we're not going to change, we're going to dig in. It's how do we change? And that's why difficult community conversations like this are important, because we have to change in some ways. It's the tactics that we're going to take to change that are the choices in front of us. And then I think there's this element of, what does it look like? I think this is what a community discussion is about, right? Right now, I think we're looking at what's the least cost renewable energy. Is that really what we want as an island community? If it costs a penny more or 2 pennies more for a kilowatt hour, is that worth it to have better siting or to have certain benefits for a community or to adopt different technologies? It may well be worth it that we're driving towards one goal around 100% renewable energy, and yet there are a lot of other considerations that people would like to ask. Just to wrap up, when we built our house in Palolo, and I worked with this guy from Waianae and his 3 sons that wound up building it, and right off the bat they said, okay, you have 3 choices, right? You've got quality, you've got speed, and you've got cost. You can have maybe 2 out of the 3, but you can't have all 3. And so I think we have to factor that in. So if we're going to have a quality, expedited, get there by 2040 system, it may cost a little bit more, and we shouldn't be shorting ourselves if that's the case.
I think this question will probably go to Colton.
To Brian?
Let's make Pono do this one. Actually, this is a technical one. Why is Hawaiian Electric pursuing advanced meters as part of a grid modernization? And like others I know, I'm electrosensitive to electromagnetic frequencies. So would you like to address that from an electrical engineering standpoint?
Sure, you can have the mechanical engineer take a swing at answering that question. Just a little bit of background for everyone. You may have had an opportunity to visit our grid modernization poster board out there in the back. One of the things that makes Hawaiian Electric a little bit different from other utilities, there are many, but one of the things that makes us different is that our strategy for grid modernization does not actually include deploying what's called an advanced meter at every single home. Many utilities in the mainland have deployed meters going back to the mid-2000s and especially in the late 2000s, and deployed it at every single customer's premise. Our strategy does include the use of advanced meters, but in a role very different from which those meters were originally designed. They were originally designed, as you can imagine, to meter and measure the use of electricity by our residential and commercial customers. In our grid modernization strategy, we're using meters for different things, primarily to be a very important sensing point at a point between where the electric grid ends and where a customer's premise begins, in which many of our customers today have their own energy resources, right? A solar system, a battery, and we're using that connection point, that point that demarks the grid and our customer as a point to measure and monitor what's going on, and to really be able to make use of the resources that many of our customers already own today, and we expect more of them in the future. So that means that these meters will not be deployed everywhere in the next couple of years, right? They're being deployed in places where customers are participating in different programs, or where the grid has the need for that sensing point right then and there. So to the person who asked this question, just understand that the intent and our plans do not call for the installation at every single home. That's number one. Number two, our advanced meters, the reference to, was it to EMF?
Yes.
Yeah. They actually, we're using several different technologies, including cellular, which is the same technology that your cell phone uses, a lower frequency radio signal, and in some cases, something called power line carrier, which is to actually send the signal through the electrical line. So we have many options of ways to communicate the information that's being measured by a meter and back to some central point where we're collecting this information and using it for our operations. So it doesn't come down to just only one technology.
This may also come your way as a question. We tend to think of renewables from an environmental standpoint. How much attention do we pay to the domestic security and resiliency aspect? And after you're done, looks like Pono is nodding vigorously, so he may have a thought to add to yours.
I'll just take this because of something that's happened recently. The man who was the chief negotiator for the SDG Sustainability Development Goals for the State Department to the United Nations, what's now known as the Paris Accord, has a one-year sabbatical in Hawaii. He's a fellow at the East-West Center. And he's been attending all of our Hawaii Green Growth meetings because of the 2030 hub. He's also been attending the policy and legislative committee meetings that I chair. And about a month ago, my colleague Celeste Connors, who's the ED for HGG, called me. I was in San Diego, and she said, I have to tell you something that Trig said. So this is not for public consumption. We don't say this publicly. So he said, Trig made a comment that is mind-blowing. And he said, from his experiences with what he's been attending and what he's been hearing in our conversations, is that he believes that Aloha and the work that we're doing, like in the Aloha Plus Challenge dashboard, is one of the most significant resources to national security which exists. I have been speaking with so many people outside of Hawaii who are coming here, whether they're developers or they're financiers, who are really wanting to push projects. And what they've realized is that's what they're doing. They're pushing projects. So Scott and I and Kurt were on a panel with a group of folks who invest in ESG. And one of the things I said is, Hawaii is our home. And we love our home. And we love our people. But you know what I don't have for our home? I have no exit strategy. When I said that, they just all leaned in. Sheryl Sandberg didn't tell them. And I said, the reason why I'm sharing that is, see, people look at Hawaii as a project. It's not. It's our home. To me, that is actually what's happening. So to what Cynthia was talking about, not just Oahu, gang. I've been asked to work in East Palo Alto because of squeeze that's happened on those people from west, north, and south with the tech companies. And are they still going to be there? Or are they going to be pushed out as well? See, this is not unique to Hawaii, but is it possible that as we navigate so that we can still have food here and use our resources, that what happens is we still have a community, but we also can teach other people how to be community? And is it possible that that's one of our biggest exportable commodities? That's why I've been saying what I've been saying about this fabric of a community, and not about we are a project. And I don't think we recognize what a gift it is of how we navigate this. Instead of being refugees and immigrants, what about being navigators and peace seekers? The resources, not the problem. Yeah, thank you.
So Colton, no pressure, but what are your thoughts about that particular statement?
I think it's a good question out there because it kind of gets to the heart of what we are trying to do with our integrated grid plan. We have a state law. We need to get to 100%, but there are a limitless amount of ways to get there that are going to have different consequences. And keeping the lights on and having that electricity that we take for granted every single day, being there on good days like tonight, where if it's not, it's inconvenient, but also being there during bad days where electricity can mean the difference between life and death. That matters, right? And the path that we take to 100%, the mix of resources that we use to get there, will have a tremendous impact on how resilient our electric system is. And I would be remiss if I didn't also talk about the 95, 96% of the rest of the electric system that's also needed there, right? We tend to focus on the sources of energy, like solar and wind and hydroelectric and geothermal. But we also need to not forget about the substations and the transmission lines and the distribution lines that makes all of that work with all of the distributed systems that you folks own to make a grid work and for electricity to work for everyone, again, on good days and bad days. Just one thing to add to that theme, when we at the utility think about our very, very important jobs of serving our customers, we think about all the different types of customers that we have. So in this question around providing resiliency and how do we think of it, we definitely think about it in terms of my father-in-law making sure that he has power, so I don't get the phone call from him when the power goes out. But I also think about it when we have the majority of the nation's defense assets sitting down the street from us, not just protecting Hawaii, but protecting this country of ours from threats that we see and can't see. And their dependency on having secure, resilient power in order for them to get their mission done, not just for them, but for all of us. And that's another very sort of important portion of resilience and the importance of resilient electricity that sometimes we forget about.
Next question has to do with how you feel about offshore wind as a source of energy. And Cynthia, suspect that it depends on where it is, but please share your thoughts on that.
Yeah, the reason why I have an opinion about this is because there have been proposals off of the island of Oahu for offshore wind energy. The one thing that I tend to remind people of is, what are the impacts? The impacts can be tremendous. We are a community that relies heavily on our nearshore waters, whether it's for fish, seaweed, whatever it is to live by. Offshore wind could potentially be viable, but you've got a couple of different things you have to answer. One is, what are the visual impacts going to be? And number two, where is the exact placement going to be? I know there were some wind farms that were proposed off of Oahu that I know for a fact which would have impacted our fishing community, our commercial fishermen, has the potential to impact some of our onshore events. Some of the questions that could not be answered was, what is that going to do to our shore breaks on the North Shore? With the proposal that was being submitted, So it's not as easy a topic as most people would like it to believe, that says, well, at least you're not placing it on the land and impacting the land, whether from an agricultural standpoint or whatever a cultural standpoint might be, where there might be resources. But there are other things that need to be considered. It is not as easy a solution as a lot of people think. The other thing is, if it's large enough to be a utility scale, the question in my mind continues to be, so how is Homeland Security going to view that if I have a substation out there that's equivalent to half of a Kahe power plant? Are you going to let my fishermen run in between all these things and go fishing? Or are you going to lock it off so that nobody can go in there? And all of a sudden, all of those resources are now off limits. So I think offshore wind, as proposed, wherever it might be proposed, needs to do that deep dive into what are the resources that are going to be affected or potentially be affected, both economically, onshore and offshore, for resources.
Josh, do you want to weigh in as well and comment perhaps on the county's perspective?
I don't know that the county has obviously jurisdictionally, is under the kuleana of the state and federal. But I do think that we have to be clear-eyed about needing at some point an all of the above strategy. Now, where they are, how much of each resource, that's something that community in partnership with, I think, all of the entities that are in this room needs to decide. But the reality is that, we can put solar on every single rooftop and we don't get the power we currently need. I think we need to recognize fossil fuels are an amazing source of power. I mean, there's just so much density in, it took millions and millions and millions of years to crunch it down into all of that dense power in one tiny little cubic inch of fuel. And so when we go to replace with renewable, the scale is larger, right, to capture that. And so I think to get to some of the equity issues, if I might have to look at some windmills, right? I mean, and where are those going to be? It's likely an offshore scenario. Is that what we think about equity when we think about placement around the island? How do different neighborhoods participate in what is, a necessary evolution on island? And I think when we talk about equity, this is something that we've taken really seriously at the county, though we don't have kuleana for the ocean areas. We went out and got grant funding at our office to hire a climate resilience and equity position. Somebody just focused on how do we think about equity around the island, around this transition that we're going to have to do, which we know is going to have to thread the eye of a needle, and it's going to be really difficult. And so I would encourage all of you to think about how does equity play a role in your role, whatever this is? And how do we make sure, because all it takes is one bad project, pushing a project rather than listening to the pull of the community or trying to navigate your way through, to set us completely back, right? Or to make it so that can't happen again. And so if we don't factor equity in, it's an integrated grid plan, right? How do we integrate justice? How do we integrate equity? How do we integrate community into that grid so that the grid can continue to proceed and go renewable? Because my fear is if it's not equitable, it's not going to be able to be renewable.
Okay. Colton, did you want to make a comment at all on that?
Sure. I'll try to be really brief. Josh sort of alluded to it. I just want to add to it just to give good context to a discussion on offshore wind or actually any technology. When we earlier looked at how do we get to 100%, one of the big findings that we had in our power supply improvement plan is that that in order to get to 100% here on the island of Oahu, we literally run out of resources. Right, 70% of the electricity that's consumed in the state of Hawaii is consumed right here on Oahu. When I took 7th grade geography at Yale Intermediate School on Maui, I learned that Oahu was the 3rd largest island, right? And when you look at the lands that are available that's not being used for agriculture, not being used for housing, not being used for business, there's not a lot of land that's left. And as renewable rich as Oahu may seem, it's not as rich as the island of Maui and the Big Island, where the use of electricity, unfortunately, is far less, about 1/5 of the island of Oahu. So what happens is that solving for 100% renewable energy on Hawaii Island and Maui, as challenging as that may be, they do not have the challenge of not having enough choices to choose from in order to get to 100%. On Oahu, we have that added challenge. If we were, and Brian, you can cover your ears, if we were to use every single allowable, permittable, relatively flat parcel of land, including ag lands, to develop solar, if we develop wind on all of the high-class wind sites on Oahu, and there actually aren't very many, and if we put rooftop solar on every home, single-family home, whether it was owned or rented, and sized it enough to offset the electricity use of that home, and put solar on 25% of the commercial spaces, Oahu would still fall short of renewable energy generated to serve load. And that's why we need to look at things that doesn't require that land, right? Whether it's importing power, renewable energy power from a neighboring island through an undersea cable system. I think our friends and neighbors on the neighbor islands would have a view on that. Could it come from the form of a renewable fuel that's brought into Oahu? That potentially could be an option, but there are issues with that. Or it's going to be something like offshore wind as one example of something that doesn't require the use of land for it to happen, right? All of which have trade-offs, all of which you can immediately think of some of the positives and negatives with any of those options, because there's really no renewable energy technology that's not impact-free, right? They just have different attributes. And the hard part of our community's job, not just the utility's job, is to help figure out what's that mix in the all of the above solution that Josh talked about that makes the most sense for us.
This may go to you as well, unless someone feels a compelling need to take it on. The next question is that some states are adopting decarbonization policy as opposed to RPS. Decarbonization provides more flexibility to balance needs. Agree?
I think Murray and Josh probably have some views on that, but let me just kick it off quickly. Hawaii is a bit unique amongst other states, where we were very early out of the gates, very focused on a renewable portfolio standard. But if you were part of the discussion way back when the RPS was first set and then increased over the years, it really comes from the fact that Hawaii is really in a different place from other states in how we think about this. So when I give presentations up in the mainland, I almost always start off with a slide that shows the globe with Hawaii in the middle and the Pacific Ocean all around us. And you can barely see the west coast of the US, you can barely see Australia and Asia, and of course you can see Antarctica. And that geographical isolation and the fact that every single drop of oil and every chunk of coal that comes to Hawaii to either produce electricity or power a car, ship, or plane needs to travel. It used to be about 3,000 miles. Now it's about 6,500 miles to get here. And oh, by the way, the 90-something% of the food that we consume from out of state also has to travel those long supply lines. And it's that risk and vulnerability of the importation of fossil fuels that really drove Hawaii's initial work around renewables and a renewable portfolio standard. And that's sort of been the North Star in the work that we've done. In the meantime, the rest of the world has sort of caught up to this idea, but tends to think a bit in a different perspective, and you can argue which is better. But the focus has been on all of the impacts of the burning of fossil fuels and other activities that can lead to climate change. And that's where decarbonization has become a focus of many places, including many other states and countries. I don't think they're incompatible, but ultimately for Hawaii, we have to think about ultimately what becomes our state policy, and maybe even more importantly, what are the things that we want to solve for in our state's policy, right? And to date, the state's policy has very been focused on the reduction in the use of fossil fuels, which is why we have, at least in my mind, why we have an RPS as the major driver. Flexibility is important, but at the end of the day, it's flexibility and options to accomplish what, right? And that's where state policy needs to really be decisive and specific about what we're trying to solve for in a law, whether we keep an RPS law or we move to a decarbonization type of policy and law.
I think if you wouldn't mind just passing that forward, but I'd like to migrate to the next question in light of the time available. The next question has to do with, okay, so we get that there are competing priorities. What is the forum where we can equitably come up with a fair plan in an urgent timeframe? Who wants to take that one?
Cynthia talked about starting early. Time is short, but I don't think the time to start on it is when you have a project. So there was a man who was working on a project and a waste-to-energy plant about 8 years ago. And he was a very frustrated man. So a good friend became Paul Zorner. He would like to bring guys with problems to my office to talk with me. And he starts talking about why the county council doesn't support him, the community, the mayor, and he's really frustrated because he's a developer, and and he makes his argument about HCEI and the reduction of fossil fuel, and he's just trying to correct everybody. So I just listened to him, and I thought, he doesn't understand at all. So I brought something. Tyler had given me this brand new blue blanket 8 years ago, and I pulled it out of my file cabinet. Just like what Colton said. I said, this is Hawaii, this beautiful blue blanket. And people come here and they see this, and they want to be a part of it. They want to make a difference. They want to do something. And it's an opportunity. And so I said, and with that, there might be some value to our proverbs and how we look at life. The type of leadership maybe we've had. Where we look for our direction. So it's not just our place, it's also our people. And then what happens is somebody sees that, wow, that's an opportunity. And then he says, you know what, you need this. Tiger Mama. One man can make a difference. Forgiveness, Jampolsky, damning, conspiracy, good to great, double gold coach, start with why. And everybody's just bringing their shit. I said, you ever been piled on? Don't feel too good, huh? Everybody's coming here piling on. Sometimes I just feel like doing this. Get off! He just sat there and he came back and he would meet again and again. See, to that question about how we can move forward, when, the timing, I think we need to understand who we are and where we are, and also help the people who are coming here. It's not because we don't want it. We need it, all of us here. Such huge advocates. But maybe there's something real special that we got to learn about before we move. And the time is not when you have a project, the time is before you have a project.
I hate when people hold back and don't really say what they're thinking. And now I know why the library is still looking for some books. We sadly are running short of time, and there's one last question, which I believe will go back to Hiko. And that question is, what follow-up will be taken by the utility on the crucial recommendations, observations, and action items that your panelists brought up here? So be my guest.
Yeah, so it's a great, I think, way to end this Q&A. And it's to sort of build off of this question and say, you know, we're conducting this public meeting tonight really at the beginning of our integrated grid planning process. And for those of you here in the panel and the audience that are stakeholder council members or working group participants, you know, it feels like we've been at it for a long time. And we've been working on this for about a year now. But we've been working not with the development of plans or alternatives. We're actually very much in the beginning of the process of developing options and cost estimates and a whole range of really boring stuff that planners like me actually enjoy doing. But we're still in the beginning of the process where we actually haven't done any analysis to even come up with options and alternatives. So tonight's discussion, the Q&A that you've seen up here, the, I guess, 53 questions now that we've gotten from you, and the discussions that you've had with the Hawaiian Electric team there in the open house, we're all going to be using that as input into our planning process. Because ultimately, with all of this advanced technical analysis that we need to do as part of our work, and our best efforts to transform our electric system to meet the range of things we need for it to do, including to be 100% renewable energy and resilient and be something that works for all communities and is reliable. At the end of the day, we need to make sure that the electric system that we create is a system that works for you as our customers, right? And so it's very important through these comments and questions we're getting tonight and beyond to guide us to make sure that the electric system we design is a system that works for your needs, right? If we don't do that, if we don't listen to your input and what we're getting tonight and through other venues that we're conducting over the last couple of weeks, then we may be building the wrong electric system, right? With all of these discussions of trade-offs and attributes, it may not deliver what you folks are really asking for. So that's really the purpose, right, of tonight, the purpose of having tonight's event at the beginning of the process. This is why we're not actually sharing any results, because surprisingly we don't have any at this point. But at the end of the day, this input and the input that we're going to continue to get from the different stakeholders we engage, the different working groups that we have, ultimately will help guide our planning effort. And that's why we're so grateful, and for myself personally, very, very thankful for all of you of giving us your Tuesday evening and sharing with us your thoughts.
Thank you so much. In the interest of Einstein's theory of relativity and time, make this very short. If before you leave this evening, you'd be kind enough to respond one more time to this survey to see if anything you heard tonight affected your thinking and caused you to make a different choice, we would appreciate that. Secondly, if you have questions that you really, really, really want an answer to, if you would be willing to submit it with your contact information, it's my understanding that HECO is committing to respond to those questions. Lastly, if you look on the reverse side of your integrated grid planning handout, you'll see some email address and a website that you can look to for some of the proceedings from tonight's discussion, and where you can also lodge questions if you wish to do so. Very hurriedly like to express much appreciation and gratitude to the panelists who have shared perspectives that I hope help you appreciate the complexity of the challenges ahead. So thank you all very much for your time. Look both ways before you cross the street, and if you need sanitizer, I have some for you. So thank you very much, everyone. Appreciate it.